Thank you for tuning in to Alberta Live, brought to you by Fuse Logic Television. This is our very first edition, and I am a bit nervous. But our endeavor is to give you outside perspectives of what people think about Alberta. Now, on a reflective note, and I promise you I won't pontificate very often, except once in a while. So on a reflective note, it does help to have outside reflections that are objective about who we are. So from oil sands to healthcare to education, we will bring you the honest opinion of those that view us objectively. Now, before we talk more about this program, I'd like to share something with you. You know, this program has been in the works since July this year, and in our first program, that is this one, we decided that we would talk about the oil sands. Now, that's the natural obsession of all Albertans. And it was coinciding with all that bashing that Alberta oil sands, or tar sands as they're famously called by the Americans, was receiving at the hands of our southern neighbors, who are also devouring our oil despite all the criticism. Never mind, it's their wont to do that, to keep bashing their oil supplies. So as I was saying, we started interviewing for this program around August or September, when all those major nasty anti-Alberta campaigns were being run by the US-based company Corporate Ethics. And we interviewed Corporate Ethics and another loud critic of the oil sands, that's Washington-based National Resource Defense Council, the NRDC. As generous as our neighbors to the south are in their criticism of Canadian oil sands, equally generous they are in granting interviews to further propagate that criticism. Unfortunately, our government thought it wiser to spend over $65,000 on just one ad in the Washington Post, rather than a whale of free publicity from outlets like ours. So, I spoke to a lot of people, tried to get a lot of people on board. Jerry Bellica, spokesman for the Premier, said in a newspaper interview that the Washington Post ad was money well spent. Well, Mr. Bellica, we weren't even charging you any money, giving you free publicity. Wouldn't it be time well spent, favoring us with a few minutes of your time? Never mind. Don't ask me who we did not ask. We, right from the Premier's spokesperson to Minister Iris Evans, I guess your size, your political leanings determine the political weightage you receive as a media outlet from politicians and the government. It's not the age of small media business, no. So much for Canadians trying to create more jobs for people like me who've been unemployed for nearly 2 years now. And of course, others at Alberta Live just kept consoling. We kept consoling ourselves, rather, for nearly 4 months, saying, never mind, you're not supposed to take political rejection too seriously. So eventually we decided to just give more airtime to our neighbors in the south. And here's what we recorded August this year. This is the beginning of a concerted effort by a US-based non-profit organization called Corporate Ethics to garner public opinion against Alberta's oil sands. This ad and billboards across the United States and the United Kingdom are a growing concern for Alberta. They come close on the heels of US moves like Section 526 of the U.S. Energy Independence and Security Act 2007 that bar federal agencies such as the military and the postal services from buying synthetic fuels if they create more greenhouse gas emissions than conventional fuels. Reportedly, oil from Canada's oil sands creates roughly 3 times the GHG emissions as compared to conventional crude. So will garnering public opinion against Alberta's oil sands solve the problem? Joining me now via Skype from San Francisco is Michael Marks, the brainchild behind this ad campaign. In the studio with me here is David McLean of Alberta Enterprise, a public policy advocacy group based out of Edmonton, Alberta. Their mission, they say, is to challenge all levels of government to make common sense decisions in the interests of all Albertans. Let's first turn to Michael Marks, Executive Director, Corporate Ethics. So, Mr. Marks, you say this is the beginning. How long do you think this ad campaign is going to continue, and what else is coming up?
Well, the campaign will continue until the government of Alberta decides that it's time to really listen to, I think, the complaints that have been raised by a number of groups around the world for the last 3 years, and freezes the expansion of the tar sands so there's no new development, and sits down with environmental groups in Canada and with First Nations and works out a solution. And we're fully funded and prepared to carry on the campaign at least for the next 3 years. And frankly, we anticipate that the government will do what it's done before, respond with more public relations and more denials, more generalities. And so it's very possible we'll have to carry on the campaign for that long. Our hope is that that's not the case.
Well, I have David with me here, and I'm sure he has lots to say about the improvements that have occurred over the last so many years, even the last 5 years, in how bitumen is extracted in Alberta. David, would you like to join in?
Well, there has been a constant rate of improvement for the last 20 or 30 years. We use less water than we ever have before. As Michael knows, we've reduced our CO2 emissions per barrel by up to 40%. So Albertans are positioned uniquely to extract this resource, exploit the resource in a responsible and sustainable way. I don't think there's anybody else better in the world to do this than Albertans. Now, there's a lot of problems with the corporate ethics program. One is the reality that the world oil supply is in decline. It's getting heavier. Whereas demand over the next 30 years is anticipated to grow dramatically. So where are people going to get their energy from? Is it going to be from Albertans or Canadians, or will it be the Nigerians, Saudis, or Venezuelans? I don't think that's very ethical. In fact, I think corporate ethics is a misnomer.
In fact, I'd like to add something here. Some 30% of existing global oil and nearly 50% of new supplies by 2015 need to be sourced from offshore, much of it from deep water. And we've had this catastrophic BP oil spill. What would you prefer?
Well, I assume that question is to me. What we would prefer is really an accelerated rate of transition off oil. In the United States right now, there's actually a leveling of demand and a decrease in demand. And our refineries are only at 80%, and even some of the most recent pipelines that have been built to bring tar sands down to the U.S. are very controversial because they've created conflicts between the suppliers and between the pipeline companies because they can't fill them up.
Michael, I'm pretty sure you're the only guy in North America who's anticipating a decline in energy demand in the United States or the rest of the world for that matter. That's absolutely ridiculous. The only way demand is going is up.
In fact, EIA projections for the next year and even the third or the fourth quarter of this year are a slight increase because of improved economic activity.
Actually, the Deutsche Bank, which has conducted a study in this area as well for investors, has said that, well, they expect worldwide the demand to go up. I was talking about the U.S. staying level, that it will peak in 2016, and after that, fuel efficiencies will begin to reduce the demand for the oil and actually make it not as competitive to have those high prices that are needed to make tar sands a profitable venture.
Well, if that's the case, that's great news for the world then, Michael. I'm not sure what the point of your campaign is. And if we're looking at a bright future where hydrocarbons aren't important anymore.
Well, I think the point of our campaign is that some of the facts that you've actually said, even in your previous statement, are actually wrong.
Oh, really? Well, let's talk about wrong facts. Let's talk about your misstep originally with your campaign. You originally stated, you said it was an editing error where you exaggerated the size of disturbed land from the oil sands, that it was twice the size of England. Very quickly you had to retract that statement. What does that say about the overall value of your campaign?
Well, as you know, when
I don't think it's funny.
Well, I think the way you're arguing it is because that error was the only error that we made. We corrected it in 24 hours.
It's the only error you made. That's the only error you made.
Document the other mistakes. And if we've made any other mistakes, why aren't you suing us? Why is not the government up there suing us? They know they can't defend their own arguments in court. Give me some documentation that any of our other claims are false because we've documented all of them. With
Well, you've got to
government
document that
statistics-
they're true. You make the claim on your website that tailings ponds are contaminating the Athabasca River. There's absolutely no evidence that tailings ponds are contaminating the Athabasca River. So why don't you back up that claim?
I don't have to. Professor Schindler, David Schindler, and his research team from the University of Alberta released a study today in Alberta. There was an article in the Globe and Mail today saying that as a result of the tar sands, there's elevated levels of at least 7 carcinogenic compounds in the Athabasca River.
I think you're misstating the study that was released today. Yeah, there was elevated levels of mercury during high flow seasons in the spring runoff. It's very natural and normal in this part of the world. I'm not sure if you've been up here, but Dr. Schindler is a respected scientist, but he's been grinding this axe for years. There is no evidence. You said on your website that something like 11 million gallons of tailings water is leaking into the Athabasca. There's no evidence of that. We can't find it. The Athabasca River is the most regulated, monitored, and understood river in the world. I grew up in Fort McMurray. The oil sands were my backyard.
All I'm asking you to do is prove it. Show me evidence.
You prove it. I mean, the onus is on you. If you're going to threaten and tarnish the image of a province around the world, the onus is on you to prove it, not us.
And we have. We provided the study.
You haven't
by
proven
the
anything. Your website is a joke. Your video has only been viewed in the UK by 5,000 people. This is a failure. People see through it, and you're getting fisted in your own comments.
So, Sunita, would it be possible for me to actually answer the question and document my statements, and then challenge my opponent here to actually document his? Because I'm happy to do that. But if all I'm going to do is be interrupted and not allowed to document my claims and have to listen to the generalities that I know are false, this is not going to be very educational for your audience.
Mr. Marks, do go ahead and let us know what your documented facts are.
Fine. In terms of the 11 million gallons, we said it was leaking into the surrounding environment and water system. That was a research study by the Environmental Defense Canada, based in Ottawa, by the Pembina Institute, based in Alberta, which is an independent research institute on energy, and they concluded that there was 11 million gallons leaking in every day. They also, then with Schindler's research, he had a research team that consisted of other professors from other universities, and they concluded that the actual monitoring system by the corporations, their RAMP program, their Regional Aquatic Monitoring Program, was not set up to properly detect these kinds of carcinogenic compounds in the Athabasca, and in fact, that they were showing up downstream as far as Fort Chip and into the delta of the Athabasca.
And they have for thousands of years.
But in elevated levels below the tar sands than they were above the tar sands. And I challenge you to show evidence, and not just generalities, that say that there, and the research studies that show that there are no carcinogenic compounds at unnatural levels below the tar sands, and you can't do it. The best researchers, including Alberta, and it's not appropriate, I think, to say that the eminent water biologist David Schindler has an axe to grind when it comes to water without providing proper contrary documentation, and you can't do it. There was another study by Professors Timoney and Lee that also confirmed that there were a number of elevated compounds below the tar sands that were not above the tar sands operations.
Well, that makes sense. It's perfectly understandable given where the tar sands deposit lie on the Athabasca River. The oil sands mining operations, there's 4 of them. They're clustered in the area where the overburden is smallest, is the shortest distance to extract that bitumen. So north of the oil sands operations, there's going to be higher levels of bitumen in the water, along with the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which have been pointed to by Dr. Schindler as possible cancer-causing agents. But again, on your website, you claim that elevated cancer rates in Fort Chip are directly attributable to the oil sands. That's absolutely false. In fact, I resent that. I absolutely resent that.
The point, Mr. Marks, is that even, what is the basic goal of the ad campaign? You're buying the United States. It's a massive energy consumer. So far, till everything was going great, demand has been consistently rising so far, I mean, till this economic downturn. Why is the emphasis, just to play the devil's advocate, why don't you pressure the United States to consume lesser? And so the incremental barrels could come to Alberta instead of going to Nigeria and countries like Venezuela, where the ideological differences between the United States and, let's say, a country like Venezuela, they're phenomenal. And yet you go in and smash Alberta. So, just for curiosity's sake, what is the ideological, what do you feel is correct ideologically?
Ideologically, what we think is correct is not to contribute to climate change with high carbon fuels. And yes, Venezuela and Mexico and Nigeria, or not necessarily Nigeria, but the Congo and Alberta are the high carbon fuels. And we think to actually increase consumption of those is a problem, which it's one of the reasons why we have tried to promote in the United States the low carbon fuel standard, which would force the United States to wean itself off these high carbon fuels and to go to more low carbon fuels like advanced cellulosic biofuels. And the government of Alberta has been paying for lobbyists in the United States full page ads to actually oppose our attempts to wean ourselves off our addiction to these fuels. And it's not just Alberta fuels, but all of the high carbon fuels. And so that's one of the reasons why we launched this campaign, is to say we need the Alberta government, and for that matter the Canadian government, to stop interfering in our efforts to wean ourselves off of these high carbon, bottom of the barrel, high toxic fuels.
And in the process, as it is, there is an economic downturn. Do you feel that Albertans are the ones who will eventually suffer? Because everyone is aware of the economic benefits of the oil sands to Albertans, and not just to Alberta, to the federal government, which gets more in terms of revenue than even Alberta. What do you have to say about this?
Well, I think that the Tinbergen Institute, which is also a Canadian institute, said that one of the biggest problems you have in Canada is the over-reliance on oil and tar sand, and the emerging reliance on tar sands oil, because it's inflating the Canadian dollar, it's suppressing your exports, and it's responsible for up to 40% of the loss of manufacturing jobs in Ontario and Quebec. And also, if you look at Alberta right now,
in fact, we have
Alberta. Don't pretend
Alberta,
to care about the Canadian economy. You don't.
You
don't care about the Alberta economy. You don't care about Canadians. So don't even go there.
In fact, I have some data here which says that they generate 52% of the incremental GDP and 18% of incremental employment. And it does run into Quebec and Ontario as well. So you have two other provinces besides the federal government which uses it for equalization, etc. You must be aware of the Canadian system. So this would be a direct blow to the economy of Alberta. So you are seeing America as it is, suffering because of the economic downturn, lack of employment. And face to face on the border, you have another country. What is going to be the social impact of this on the Americas?
Well, I think the bigger question is, what's the social impact of climate change on the world? And when Alberta's tar sands are the #1 largest contributor to the growth of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, according to Alberta Canada last year, I think that is the issue that trumps all of the other issues. So that's where we land. I know you can argue for jobs. Clearly, tar sands create jobs, although as the research from Tinbergen suggests, they also destroy jobs in other provinces. And yes, there's equalization, but we think that Canada's making a big mistake to actually put all of its eggs in a basket. In fact, our conversations with Alberta officials have suggested that they have a huge billions of dollars deficit, in large part because they've become so reliant on oil that when there's a downturn in the economy, it actually hurts them, that they're not diversified. And so at the end of the day, my ethical responsibilities to future generations and to make sure that climate change does not destroy their ecological system. And I place that value much higher than I do on the immediate jobs or the revenues that the government is getting, I think, which is ill-gotten gain.
So what are your plans? Are you going to move on with this ad and go to other countries as well, or is it going to?
Yes, we are. We'll be announcing in September other countries where we're moving on with the campaign. And then in the spring of next year, this year we really started it intentionally late, because we really wanted to sound an alarm bell to Canada and Alberta specifically to say, please, this is a major concern for the world. Don't just respond with more public relations. Respond by actually engaging in a reasonable dialogue about how to fix the problems with the tar sands. But next year, we'll actually start the campaign and intensify it in March when people are making their tourist decisions about going to Alberta. And I think it's important to remember, this is not ultimately just about tourists. This is about Alberta's brand, which has committed $25 million to try to rebrand itself after all the criticism 3 years ago around tar sands. So ultimately, this will affect all of Alberta's businesses, not just tourism. I think this is our wish would be that the Alberta government would do what Canadians are famous for, which is sitting down and engaging in a constructive dialogue. And if that happens, we'd be happy to suspend this campaign.
Michael, the constructive dialogue's been happening for decades. I'm here. I see it.
Not with environmental.
Not with the likes of you. We need some truth from your side. We need some constructive criticism from your end. Your website is strewn with misleading exaggerations. You use our First Nations people as mascots for fundraising. The cancer scare that you're trying to kick up is irresponsible, unethical, and frankly, we cannot stand for this.
Give us some facts. You keep telling us that we need to provide facts.
You talk about rare forms of cancer on your website. There are no instances of bile duct cancer found in Fort Chip. Dr. O'Connor, the guy who blew the whistle on this, has been reprimanded by the College of Physicians. The Alberta government has studied this community to death. There's more studies coming. There are elevated cancer rates in Fort Chip, but there's no link to the oil sands. In fact, it's more likely that it's lifestyle related. The First Nations people I talk to resent your attitude, resent using them as mascots for fundraising, and see it as just more colonialism, paternalism, and exploitation.
There's actually been, according to Alberta Health, there's actually been a 7-fold increase in the number of biliary cancers in Fort Chip. There was a 3-fold increase in leukemia and lymphoma. That is Alberta, Canada statistics. And once again, I'm the only one here providing documentation for my claims. And also, we work with First Nations in Fort Chip and in British Columbia who are now vigorously fighting the proposed Enbridge Gateway pipeline. And in fact, those very groups have actually had press conferences where they've gone on record opposing the tar sands, and in Enbridge, in the case of British Columbia, opposing that pipeline from the tar sands. So once again, I'm pointing to the documentation that we're using, and my opponent here seems to simply want to assert that we're making claims.
You're cherry picking. You're cherry picking. The same study that you're pointing to also completely counters everything Dr. John O'Connor alleged. This man has been reprimanded by the College of Physicians. Rare forms of bile duct cancer associated with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons have been found to be non-existent in Fort Chip. But I would also ask you, you say you're working with First Nations people. Do you talk to the people in Fort McKay? That community can see the oil sands operators from the doorsteps. They have Aboriginal-owned businesses that employ hundreds of First Nations people. Do you talk to them?
We do, and actually I've been to the tar sands several times. I've met with the people in Fort McKay, and I've met with the people in Fort Chip and the Athabasca Cree First Nation, Mikisew Cree First Nation. And while it is true in Fort McKay there are many more businesses that are linked into the tar sands, even there's starting to be dissension as they kind of start to sense that the tar sands are surrounding them, that there's a constant smell of hydrocarbons that is concerning to the community. And so it's granted, it's not uniform. I mean, many First Nations jobs do rely on the tar sands, but I can tell you that we're representing the interests of those that do not want to see the tar sands.
Well, thanks for that clarification. That's an important distinction.
Just a few minutes ahead, I mean, just a few minutes back, you said that the U.S. is an independent country and that you are entitled to your decision of deciding where your oil comes from. In the same way, Canada is an independent country, and I'm sure that the government is capable of looking after the problems or the resultant problems from oil sand production. My question to you, Mr. Marks, is do you think that the campaign that you have started off, do you think it would be better if you would target the oil industry to better itself in terms of looking after these problems instead of just axing the very source of employment? I mean, there are ways you could, why not take on the kinds of BP and ExxonMobil to head on and ask them to improve the way that they extract oil, to invest in new ways of extracting oil? Why this?
Well, actually, we are doing exactly that. And, in fact, there have been major shareholder resolution efforts with BP, with Shell, Statoil in Europe, and Total, and in the United States with ConocoPhillips and with Exxon and Chevron. And all of those oil companies have vigorously resisted any resolutions which would force them to even look at how they may need to modify their operations in the tar sands to make them more environmentally friendly. So we've turned to this kind of as a last resort. The reality is that Albertans are electing a government that's really almost a salesman for the oil industry, and it's vigorously interfering in our efforts to try to wean ourselves off oil. So this is really, in many ways, our last resort. Now, other groups will continue to work on the oil companies, but let's be real. I mean, the oil companies don't have any allegiance to the citizens of Alberta. Their allegiance is to their shareholders. And their interest is not in climate change. It is in profits. And our interest is to the fiduciary value of protecting future generations from climate change. So I think at the end of the day, you know, we're more than willing to document our facts, but ultimately we are also saying that any industry that is contributing to climate change as significantly as the tar sands operations of Alberta is, needs to be one that's reined in and brought back under control in terms of its carbon emissions. And by the way,
I think one of the problems with your campaign is that you mentioned earlier the Alberta brand, that you're attacking the Alberta brand, but you're also attacking Alberta people. You're attacking hoteliers, restaurant owners in small-town Alberta. I'm not sure if those victims of this campaign deserve to be victims. Alberta's a big place. It's a big province, and I'm not sure if your campaign is fair in that regard.
You know, in a democracy, just as the United States, I may not have voted for George Bush, but I'm responsible for the decisions he made as my president. And my responsibility was to try to vigorously oppose those activities that he engaged in or decisions he made that I thought were really deleterious to the world. Same goes for Albertans. While you want to segment it out and say, well, there's oil, and then there's hoteliers, and then there's tourists, and there's other businesses, I just go, all Albertans are responsible in a democracy for the government that they elect. And the government they elected and have been electing for the last 30 years is extremely conservative. It's really put the monitoring and in many ways, responsibility for supervision of the oil industry in the hands of the oil companies.
Extremely
and I think
conservative, Michael?
It's probably the most conservative government in North America. Yes, absolutely.
Turning to David, we do need questions. I mean, we do need answers, perhaps, from the oil sands developers as well. Do you think that they have made any efforts, or there is an endeavor to better their image? It's the government of Alberta that's spending money on the ad campaign. It's the taxpayers' money that is going into this campaign. This is hurting the ordinary Albertan. What are the oil sands developers doing about it? Why don't they fight this battle?
Here's the thing that I'd like to clarify. My organization isn't as concerned about the image of the industry as it is ensuring that the facts are out there, that we're having a constructive debate. And we're just as interested in holding energy companies to account and urging them to adopt better practices. And we do see some evidence that there's some improvement. We don't think it's fast enough, and we think technology to deal with tailings ponds has to be sped up. We need it faster. We need it now. We need better reductions on SO2 emissions. We need better stewardship all around. But I'm convinced that we're capable of doing that.
I was wondering about your president. He's been a former director with the PC party of Alberta. I was wondering if, as an advocacy group, that does not align him more with, with the government and the government's decisions. How would you be representing Albertans, ordinary people, and not just big government and big oil? How would you do that? How do you think you're doing that?
Well, our mandate comes from our membership, and for years we've been very outspoken about the Alberta government needs to be stronger internationally at promoting this industry and getting the facts out there. We did an event in Washington, D.C. where we spoke to decision makers there. We've been to Geneva, Switzerland. We've hosted business leaders from across North America on tours of the oil sands so that they can take a look at these facilities and decide on their own. We are independent from government and totally accountable to our members.
However, big bad oil, it's not seen in the best of. It's not seen in a very good light. And what comes across loud and clear is that the Stelmach government or the Alberta government today is spending hard-earned tax money, my money, your money, to defend something that the oil sands developers should be defending themselves.
I couldn't agree more.
What are you doing to forward this to them? Because you do represent them and you do have alliances with them. What do you think your company, as advocacy, as a non-profit organization, should be doing?
Our advice to the Alberta government was to be on the record when needed, but we never recommended spending as much money as they're spending to rebrand the province. I do believe that lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. to fight against legislation that will be deleterious to our economy is a wise investment. Because I tell you, Michael Marks and his friends at NRDC, etc., are outspending us 10-1 in Washington lobbying. And the result is Waxman-Markey. So to say that his hands are clean, that they don't engage in lobbying, is really naive. And
I think Marks wants to join us. And
That's absolutely not true. In fact, there was just a study last week that was released on the amount of money that was spent by the oil industry. It was $176 million to defeat Waxman-Markey. If anybody thinks we have anywhere near remotely near that amount of money, it's ridiculous. So again, you need to document your claims. Mm-hmm. Everything you've said so far has not been documented. It's been asserted. And again, I just would bring back, your point is well taken. You know, you defend the oil industry, and you think that they should be down here lobbying against legislation that would have helped the United States wean itself off its addiction to oil. We just think the United States needs some tough love at this point. It needs its good neighbor to the north not to continue to act like a pusher to keep us addicted for the next 30 to 50 years to the dirtiest, most carbon-intense, high-toxic fuel on the planet.
Michael, but the problem is you were pushing American consumers into the arms of the Saudis and the Nigerians. So that is not an ethical choice. The more ethical choice of the two is Canadian oil.
The marketplace has already chosen. Refineries prefer Saudi sweet crude because it's light. They don't have to refine it. They don't as intensely as they do the carbon. To get the carbon and the toxics out of the Alberta fuels. And in fact, they make a higher profit on it, which is why they prefer Saudi crude.
Even as we speak, Mr. Marks, apparently there are some American companies, refineries that are redefining their, they are retrofitting to meet supplies from Alberta. even as we speak. So
That's
there
true.
is this, there is a disconnect. Are we just hitting Albertans? I mean, the big oil companies, the big refineries in the U.S. are just going ahead. They are making those changes to accept crude from Canada. So even as you speak, even as, it's just hurting the ordinary Albertans. Would you agree or no?
No. Our business is really sorry for the interruption there. We know that oil companies want to expand their refineries to actually process this heavier crude because, especially in the Midwest, it's already coming in. And our job is really to say, that we just don't think that that's the future, that really we ought to be spending more money on fuel efficiency, on mass transit, and on low-carbon fuels and really developing that industry instead. And so, yes, oil companies are doing that. Yes, it's a problem. Yes, we're fighting that. And no, it doesn't help when the Alberta government is paying lobbyists to encourage it.
Michael, the problem is that the entire global petroleum supply is getting heavier. The light stuff, yes,
that's the problem.
Operators like it better. So there's a disconnect between what you're advocating and reality. The reality is that the world's going to need this hydrocarbon supply for 40, 50 years. We don't have the magic solution, the magic bullet, the technology that's going to allow us to move away from hydrocarbons. So until then, we are better off being invested in responsibly and sustainably using energy from Canada and Canada's oil sands because that's our destiny. So we got to get it right, and we need folks like you on board to help us do that.
Well, here's what I would propose then. We've both acknowledged in this interview that there's problems with the emissions, there's problems with the pollution, and my proposal would be, and I think this is really, very reasonable at this point, is they're already producing 1.5 million barrels a day from the tar sands. There is even Peter Lougheed, I believe, the previous premier of Alberta, has said we really need to slow down the expansion of the tar sands and address these issues. Why don't we freeze the expansion of the tar sands at this point? No new approvals. And have environmental groups, and it doesn't need to be us, Canadian environmental groups and First Nations, sit down with oil companies and government, really look at some of these problems that we all agree are there, and find out how to fix them. And if they can be fixed, then put those as requirements, as new requirements on anybody who comes in the future into the tar sands. So you still get the revenues from the existing operations. They're not out of business, but they're actually engaging in a constructive dialogue.
And then would you stop the cancer scare? Would you stop it then, Michael?
Well, here's what we would say there.
Fear-mongering?
Please. The Alberta government has made claims that there's no causal link, but they've not studied to confirm that there's no causal link. Of the understanding that finally there's Alberta Health is about to undertake that study after 3 years of these concerns, and because there are proven elevated levels of these cancers downstream, and they are related to the same kind of compounds that are in the tar sands. So my proposal there, again, I hope would be reasonable. Let's let Alberta Health actually finally test the causal link and determine one way or the other whether there's a relationship or not. And I'm more than willing to just say that there are elevated levels and they are related to the kind of compounds in the tar sands.
Related,
is there a causal
word
link?
they're using. You can't
Let's
use
find out.
that word. There's no proven link. Show me
related
without a proven link. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are wild cancer. It's false. You know it.
No. The aromatic hydrocarbons are linked to biliary cancer.
True.
Now,
Yes.
are the polycyclic hydrocarbons in the tar sands linked to the biliary cancers in Fort Chip? We don't know.
Exactly.
And we've been
withdraw
very
from the
careful
website.
to say, no. Our point is exactly correct on the website. It says that the cancers in Fort Chip are linked to the same compounds that are in the tar sands.
It's a nice turn of a phrase, but it's not accurate and it's not ethical.
It's not
You're creating
it's not
fear
a
in a
turn of
community
phrase.
that's unfounded.
that let's do a study to find out if it's not true.
It's been studied. More studies are underway.
Yep.
What you're not telling viewers is that cancer rates in general are higher in First Nations communities in the United States and in Canada. And there's been no evidence to show that Fort Ship is an outlier there.
Show me that you say it has been studied. What study? What study looked at the causal link between the compounds in the Athabasca River and the cancers in Fort Ship? There has been none. And what I'm proposing is that we just cool the debate on that particular issue, acknowledge that there's elevated levels, and let's finally have Alberta, after 3 years, stop engaging in public relations and actually test to determine whether it's true or not.
Michael,
we do know from Dr. Schindler.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it here. We'll have to leave it here. Thank you so much for joining us today, both of you, and we do look forward to more interaction with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now the question on your minds must be, why did I not speak to someone in the oil industry? We thought about that too. We spend more time chasing industry spokespeople from various companies, more time than chasing even politicians. Private sector bureaucracy? Who says it does not exist? In Alberta, it does. No luck, right from Mr. John Thompson of Oilsands developers to the Nexans and the Suncors and ConocoPhillips. We requested for someone to give us their perspective. Now, I don't want to blame them either. You know why? It's our fault. We should not have got in touch with them at the height of the migratory season. I guess they were too busy keeping further ducks from falling into perhaps undeclared tailing ponds. Imagine discovering tailing ponds as they become the oily resting place of ducks and all sorts of flying creatures. Of course, add to that the fact that Ottawa has started going to bed with U.S. oil giants to lobby U.S. government to give up its newfound Obama government love for a cleaner environment policy. Instead, I spoke with another harsh critic of the tar sands, the NRDC. I took on advocacy on behalf of the oil sands. Never mind, I was not even rewarded by a reciprocal interview. The defense of oil sands was all part of speaking up for the province. Here's my interview with Susan Casey. Joining me now from Washington, D.C., from the powerful National Resources Defense Council is Susan Casey Lefkowitz. Susan, the NRDC seems to have gone in for a concentrated attempt to talk about the oil sands and the negative impact it's having on the environment. Is there any particular reason that you are so averse to the oil sands, despite the fact that it's contributing immensely to the global economy?
Well, Sunita, thank you very much for having me on the show. The Natural Resources Defense Council is an U.S.-based environmental advocacy group, and we do a lot of work on energy and climate issues. And one thing of particular concern to us is the fact that oil companies have been moving forward with ever more difficult to access dirty forms of oil that are only making global warming worse. And tar sands is one of those. So tar sands is part of our bigger campaign to try to avoid fuels that make global warming worse while building a clean energy economy in the United States and internationally.
We do appreciate, and the whole world does appreciate, the fact that environment is a major resource. I mean, it cannot be destroyed. But one of the factors we were wondering at is the exponential growth in the U.S. Consumption of oil. So the one question that people here do keep asking is, why not attack the source, which is U.S. oil consumption?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it is indeed something that NRDC puts an enormous amount of resources into doing. A huge part of our work within the United States is working on energy efficiency, energy conservation, cleaner fuels, better transportation methods such as smart growth and more use of transit, and green buildings. So there's a lot of work that we are doing because we agree that it's critical that you look both at energy consumption as well as at energy production and extraction.
Yet among the OECD countries, only the United States is expected to show significant increases in oil consumption of about 0.15 million barrels per day in both 2010 and 2011. This despite the fact that the U.S. is going through an economic downturn. How would you explain this to Albertans?
I think one thing that we'll be seeing as we move forward in the United States is a lessening of the demand for oil. One thing that's interesting is that despite the fact that we haven't been able to get a strong climate bill in the United States, the Obama administration is still moving forward very forcefully with different measures that would cut our dependence on oil and increase energy efficiency. And we see that also at the state level. And so I think that what we're looking at is a new age in the United States of taking it very seriously that we have to build a clean energy economy, that's how we're going to be competitive in the future, and this holds true for Canada as well. And it's how we're going to deal with what is the major security threat to all of us in the world, which is global warming.
And what about the economic downturn? That's a major threat as well. Would you agree on that? And you would, to a certain point, agree that the oil sands are vital because the downturn in the economy could lead to a lot of imbalances.
The economic downturn is, of course, a very serious concern. But the way to get out of that is by investing in energy technology that is going to take us far into the future. Looking at energies of the past, like tar sands or other forms of oil, is not the way to build a long-term sustainable investment in jobs and the economy. That comes from looking at newer technologies like wind and solar and geothermal.
It's interesting that you're talking about technology because I was doing some research and I understand that the U.S. oil-dependent technology the technology growth is exponential of devices that rely on oil to function. So perhaps that explains in part, besides of course the transportation, the fact that the United States is a huge consumer of oil. And why not Alberta? If it is consuming so much, why not Alberta?
Well, I think if you're asking why wouldn't we be buying the oil from Alberta, I think the answer is that in the United States we need to be moving beyond oil. We need to be reducing our dependence on oil, looking at cleaner technologies, and every time oil companies find a new, riskier, dirtier form of oil, such as tar sands, that leads us into the past instead of into the future. And this holds true not just for the United States, but for Canada as well, which has enormous potential also for the cleaner technologies, not just for the dirty forms of fuels such as tar sands.
So what would Albertans have to do? I mean, the oil companies, would further reduction in CO2 emissions perhaps help? Because till the demand is growing.
I think that it's really not just about cleaning up the tar sands. I mean, obviously the existing tar sands operations need to be cleaned up. It's scandalous, the kinds of environmental health problems that they're causing, the damage to wildlife in the boreal forest, the CO2 emissions. But as far as expansion of the tar sands, it's not that you just clean up the tar sands and somehow expansion becomes okay, because of course a huge part of the emissions is in the end use of the oil, in cars and in trucks and in airplanes. And so what we really need is to stop expansion of fuel sources like tar sands and instead be moving into other forms of clean energy that provide us also with just a longer term economic security.
So till the time that those substitute energy generating technologies can be developed, what's the way out?
Well, we have those substitutes now. I mean, the alternative energy and using more energy efficiency, those are things that exist right now, and it's about investing in them more, bringing them up to speed at a higher commercial level. What we don't need is an expansion of the tar sands. We already, in the United States, import almost 1 million barrels per day, and we already have an infrastructure that could import even more than is currently being produced. What we don't need is yet more pipelines and yet more refinery upgrades in the United States. that would essentially continue our dependence not only on the existing tar sands oil that's already coming in, but on expansion of tar sands oil in the future. The United States wants to be a country in the future that is built on a clean energy economy, and tar sands oil does not fit in a clean energy economy.
And how serious do you think the United States is in actually stopping or preventing this oil from being transported into the U.S.? Do you think it's serious or?
Well, we see a rising awareness in the United States about tar sands oil and its impacts on the environment and on people. For example, just recently there have been a spate of oil pipeline disasters, mostly with the Enbridge oil pipeline, for example, in Michigan, and where there was the spill of 1 million barrels into the Kalamazoo River. The BP oil disaster in the Gulf, I think, really raised awareness about riskier forms of oil that did not used to be economically viable in the past, such as deep water. Well, tar sands falls into that same category. And so we've been hearing voices in Congress and in the administration and from business leaders in the United States, as well as from First Nation leaders and environmental groups saying, is this really the kind of oil that we want to have in our future, or should we be trying to move beyond oil as we move forward?
So the way out would be not to invest further, you think?
That's right. The way out is no more new pipelines, no more new refinery upgrades in the United States, and no expansion of tar sands in Canada, and cleanup of what's already been done.
And do you think that this is actually going to happen? Because, as I said, the demand is going to continue to rise. And, if it doesn't come from Alberta, it comes from perhaps Saudi Arabia or Nigeria, which have questionable backgrounds in terms of how the oil money is spent. For instance, correct me if I'm wrong, Saudi Arabia, the cost of extraction is just $1 a barrel. And the price rise has been up to $100 per barrel. That gives them a huge amount to reinvest in arms, so that's worse.
Well, what we say is it's not about one type of oil versus another. It's about moving beyond oil altogether into a clean energy technology and clean energy economy that has a much more sustainable future as we move forward.
Okay, thank you so much, Susan. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I think we covered all of the main issues.
Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Yeah, thank you, Sunita. Good to talk to you.
Bye.
Bye.
That's about it from me on the oil sands. But I have here with me Walter Schwabe of Fuse Logic TV, that's hosting Alberta Live, and he'll fill us up on further on the future of Alberta Live.
Hello, Sunita.
Hi.
Great job today.
Thank you.
I want to thank all the viewers for tuning in to Alberta Live today. We've had some technical difficulties also with the Michael Marks interview, with a little bit of feedback and so on. So I want to appreciate your patience. Going live is never an easy thing to do. And so from time to time, we're human just like anybody else. But it was a really great show. I think that there was a lot of great interviews done today, in the sense a lot of good discussion. I think that you really cultivated a lot of good discussion with your interviews, so great job for that.
Thank you. So what do you have in mind, Walter, for this show? I mean, do you have any future information that our viewers could mull on?
Well, Alberta Live is, as you said at the opening of the show, is really about asking what the world thinks of Alberta. We have our own ideas, we have our own perceptions. We, as Albertans, think that the world might think of us a certain way, but we want to go out and actually ask that question, as you did today. And then, where appropriate, hold people accountable for their actions, for their discussions, but also just we're curious, right? We're curious because we are part of a global community on a multitude of levels, and that's what Alberta Live is really all about.
So, do you have any fixed schedules for this program?
Well, in part that depends on the availability of the people we want to talk to, and as you build out the show that you are doing, I know that the next show we want to put on is really about healthcare here in Alberta, and we want to, I think, delve into healthcare around the world. So we're looking for probably a healthcare show in January, and we'll post the schedule on FuseLogic's Facebook page as well as on the site here as well.
On the internet site.
FuseLogic.tv. Yeah.
And do give us your feedback. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and this will be hosted on the web, so you can go to FuseLogic Television and catch up with it, just in case you've not been able to tune in live. And have a great week. Thank you so much once again.